Great Group Education Fund is dedicated to educating the public and professionals in our business with fact-based information featuring the experts in our profession, so that we all might do a better job of helping college athletes realize the promise of an educational degree and becoming all they can be as students and athletes. So we welcome you to our 34th webinar. If you have your calendars out, please save Thursday, April 18th for our next webinar, which will be the complete proceedings of the Allen Sack National Symposium held at Howard University. Each session will be offered as a separate webinar program with registration opening next week, and you'll receive an email when registration is open. If you're in the DC area or can come to the symposium, please do. We'd love to meet you, and you'll have a chance to question the panelists and meet them in person. So put April 18th on your calendars. We'll announce all of our panelists this coming week, but just as a glimpse, given the current issue of athlete compensation, Michelle Roberts, former NBA Players Association Executive Director, a practicing expert on player unions, and Jeffrey Kessler of Winston Strawn, the lawyer litigating 2 multi-billion-dollar antitrust cases that could financially capsize college sport, and Arthur Bryant of Bailey Glasser, among the top Title IX litigators in the country, are just 3 great speakers featured on our program. We hope you can join us, but if you can't, please consider sponsoring a student to attend. Students in the local DC area majoring in sports law, sports management, or other sports-related field. Each year, we raise enough funds to ensure that half of our symposium attendees are students attending at no charge, with preference to students attending lower-resourced institutions. I've asked Becca to post a link in the chat room if you'd like to help us make a student attendance possible. Thanks to all of our panelists for their time, expertise, and ideas today, and to all of you attending. Webinars provide us with the opportunity to share new ideas, recalibrate our thinking on issues, and get up to date on important topics. We are so pleased to have you join us. And with that, I'm honored to introduce the moderator of today's program. Please meet Mark Hyman, holding the George Solomon Endowed Chair in Sports Journalism at the Merrill College of Journalism at the University of Maryland. Thank you, Mark.
Good morning. Actually, good afternoon to some of you, and thank you, Julie. Before we meet our panelists, I just want to make some points. I want to emphasize that the panelists are expressing their own opinions and not the opinions of the organizations for which they work, unless they make that distinction in their remarks. Also, I want to express my thanks and appreciation to the Drake Education Fund for sponsoring this prize, which in my opinion advances 2 very important goals. First, the prize brings attention to the best of sports journalism produced by college students, like the ones that we'll be hearing from today. Secondly, it provides validation for these students. And as a classroom teacher, I know how important that is. For these students to really recognize the impact and the importance of their work. So to the student journalists on the Zoom, I want to assure you that your work is being seen and it is truly valued. I served as chair of the prize committee, and I was joined by an expert panel of judges who I am honored to introduce to you now. Liz Clark is a recently retired sports reporter focusing on enterprise stories for the Washington Post. Liz spent 8 seasons covering the Washington NFL team, as well as 9 Olympic Games. And she also covered 3 World Cups and has written extensively about college sports, tennis, and auto racing. Michael Fletcher is a senior writer with ESPN's Enterprise and Investigative team. And before that, Mike wrote for ESPN's The Undefeated, focusing on politics, criminal justice, and social issues. And prior to that, Mike spent 21 years at the Washington Post, where his beats included the national economy, the White House, and race relations. Shannon Scoville is assistant professor of sport communication at the University of Tennessee. She's also a journalist who is focused on women's sports, and particularly college wrestling, and the Olympic Games. And I'm quite sure she's the only former Division I student athlete on the panel today. In addition, she was a Fulbright scholar. So Shannon Scoville has packed a lot into her career already. Not with us today is John Wilner of the San Jose Mercury News. He couldn't be with us, but John was a member of the committee, read all of the entries, was a real asset to the committee. So we miss you, John, and thank you for your good work. Now, I have the honor of introducing the student winners who are with us today, starting with the winner of the 2024 Drake Student Journalism Prize for Investigative Reporting in Intercollegiate Athletics, the Daily Northwestern, an independent news organization at Northwestern University. And from the Daily Northwestern here today, we have Alice Brown, a journalism major, Cole Reynolds, a journalism and anthropology major, and Divya Bradwar, journalism, data science, and psychology major. Is Divya with us today? She's not here. Okay, well, Alice, Cole, and Divya all served as print managing editors at the Daily Northwestern. We also have our second prize winner here today from the Quinnipiac Journal at Quinnipiac University, Catherine Kat Murphy. So Kat is a journalism major who is minoring in political science, and she is the news editor of the Quinnipiac Chronicle. So welcome to our student journalists and congratulations on your award-winning work. So speaking for the judges, the senior members of the Zoom panel today, I know that we want this call to be mostly about calling attention to the student journalists, and we want to hear about their great work, how their stories came together, the challenges that they overcame, and a lot more. But to start, perhaps we should kind of take a step back and think about the coverage of college sports today and the title of this panel, which is, what is the role of the press in covering college sports? So for both the veteran journalists and the student journalists, let's consider that question. In the era of NIL, the transfer portal, radical conference realignment, what is the role of the press in covering college sports, and has that changed in any meaningful way? So let's start with the senior members of the panel, and I'm gonna ask Liz Clark to raise her hand. Liz, I think you're still on mute.
Yes. So sorry for my slowness in finding the unmute button. So thank you for calling on me, Mark. I think this is an essential question, but first I just want to congratulate all the winners. It was so humbling and thrilling to read your work, to evaluate the work, and your honors are so well deserved, and I know your futures are super bright. But to your question, Mark, I think there are two profound movements afoot, transformational movements afoot that are unprecedented. The upshot of which means that the coverage of college sports has never been more important, and within that, the role of student journalists has never been more vital. And those two macro trends, one is what Mark alluded to or referred to in all that is upending the landscape of college sports, the NIL, the explosion of coaches' salaries, the conference realignment, ineffectiveness of the NCAA. I mean, and many of these changes were not planned, have not been well thought out. The ramifications are not clear, particularly in the NIL landscape. So it's just a fast-moving Wild West that's going on in college sports. The other broad trend are the struggles of daily newspapers, of the media itself, and particularly the newspapers that have been counted on to be watchdogs of institutions, watchdogs of higher education. We all know the sad metrics of shrinking staffs, shrinking resources for enterprise, for investigations, the drumbeat of clicks and popular items that aren't necessarily the same as deep dive investigations. So what's going on at major newspapers and what's exploding in college sports, to me, means that the voice of those closest to what's going on in college sports, which are the students and in the student athletes themselves, it's just never been more vital that they are now the guardians and the watchdogs, and they are calling attention to things that don't add up, hypocrisies or unfairness, inequities, and in many ways they're leading the charge. And the national media are following. So the work is so very important. And I'll stop there because I know I went on too long, but thanks for letting me weigh in.
No, I think you set things up very well. Mike Fletcher, what do you think?
No, I agree with everything Liz said, and I think there's a kind of an added element here where of just plain old access, right? I mean, it's interesting, like with what I call the professionalization of what used to be amateur sports. Everyone's treated like a figure now, you know. So collegiate athletes, I've even run into high school athletes who are kind of handled, you know. You just can't talk to them, right? You can't have a conversation. It's rare to spend time with them. You don't see the kind of profiles you used to see. Now and then they pop up. At ESPN, we just did a great profile of Caitlin Clark, where, you know, Wright Thompson had a lot of access to her, and she's obviously a huge figure. But that's more the exception than the rule these days. Like the kinds of stories that these student journalists did, I would venture to say would almost have been impossible for kind of, you know, the old line. And I don't like these terms either, Liz. What do I say? I don't want to say mainstream, dying. I don't want to use any of these terms, but, you know, for kind of the old, what we thought of the Guardians to capture. We just wouldn't have known about these stories. We wouldn't have had the contact, wouldn't have had that daily access. And I think it points to kind of what Liz so rightly calls the vital role of student journalists. You guys are the ones who know these athletes as people. We know them as kind of maybe a person at this, you know, at the podium. Maybe you get a conversation with the parent. Maybe you talk to the AAU coach, you know, but you don't really get the full measure of these people. So that really leaves it a lot on student journalists. And obviously, you know, these stories are a reflection of that, hey, you know, we're in good hands, but certainly the responsibilities with the student papers.
Yeah, I think access is an issue I know Mike and I have talked about frequently, but the challenge is now to speak to the people whose voices you really need in stories to tell a story, you know, thoroughly. And we're going to return to that. Shannon Scoville, I'd like to hear you talk to us about non-revenue sports. And, you know, wrestling, you may be the preeminent wrestling reporter in the country right now. How are all of these, you know, forces impacting non-revenue sports?
Well, I think the role of student journalism, apologies for my voice, I'm battling the flu here. The role of student journalists are that much more important in the Olympic sports because they don't get national coverage. I read student journalism all the time for wrestling, whether it's Iowa or South Dakota State, you know, Ohio State, any of those schools, because those are students who are on the ground. And I think that's what these stories best represent, is students that are there every single day. They're watching what's happening, even if they don't have access through a one-on-one interview or even a press conference to ask specific questions. They're watching things, they're noticing patterns, they're identifying trends that then they can dig further into. And that's not something that all national reporters are able to do, simply because they can't be in 75 locations at one time. So these student journalists have such an important role. And again, these stories demonstrate how great student journalism can be and why it's so important, both to the national discussion and to college sports as a whole, because a lot of the stories that were covered by these reporters on this call may have been undercovered, period, if it were not for the students here. And there's stories with severe consequences and of major importance to the college sports landscape. So greatly appreciative of student journalism for Olympic sports and for the traditional revenue producing sports, and grateful for what these stories demonstrate for other students aspiring for this kind of level of investigative reporting.
So to the student journalists on the call, we certainly want to hear from you. We're putting a lot of pressure on you. Our expectations are very high. do you guys feel like, do you have the access? Does being a student give you, do you feel an advantage in covering these stories? Or is it an obstacle or a combination? Who wants to take that one?
I'll take it. I'll take it. Thank you. Just to start off, thank you all for inviting us here. I'm so glad to be here and honored by all of your comments and this award. And I think I speak for the others in saying that. I in terms of access, in terms of just getting an interview, I think it's still difficult for us, right? Like maybe not everybody in the United States pays attention to student journalists, but the colleges, the SIDs, the people managing the athletes certainly know that we're doing the work too. And so they tend to treat us similarly to a regular reporter. Where I do think a student has an advantage is that you are essentially a part of the same community that they are a part of, right? Even if you haven't gone through the same things as a student athlete, maybe not even close, there's still shared aspects of being a student at, say, Northwestern that you can offer up in an interview. You can in some ways you can relate your experience to theirs, even if it's at a superficial level, sometimes deeper, but sometimes that's all it takes to let them know that you are a part of their community, that you as much as you want to report and hold the community accountable, that you're still a part of it, that you still are interested in ultimately protecting it. And so I think whether I don't think necessarily from student journalists can get more like interviews with athletes. I think when we do, there's kind of a shared connection and kind of a shared rapport that's already built into the interaction that 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 you can tap into. And I think we did when we were reporting these stories.
That's
Can
great.
I ask a
Cole.
quick question, Mark, or is it too soon?
No, go ahead.
I'm curious about what you say, and it makes some good points there, Cole. I'm just curious, and this is for any of the student journalists. How separate are the student athletes, particularly in the kind of the revenue sports, like on campus? Because when I talk about access, I'm thinking way back to when I went to college, and I wasn't a student athlete, but I was the kind of guy who would play intramurals and be in the gym all the time, and you would see the varsity athletes around. You kind of get to know some of them a little bit. You may even be at the same party. Here and there, you might have a class with them. You see them in the student union. Is that like, are those days over? And I know BU wasn't a big sports school. It's Division I, but it's like, sort of small time Division I. At Northwestern, are these guys totally and women totally separate from kind of the student body, or, how integrated are they? Anyone take that?
Yeah, I think from my experience, you'll see them in class, you'll see them kind of around the student union sometimes, and definitely in the gym, but uh at least nowadays, even Northwestern, I don't consider our basketball team did really well the last 2 years. Gotta shout them out. But I don't necessarily consider Northwestern a super sports powerhouse. Just generally, we have a couple great teams. Lacrosse, field hockey have been great for a while, um, but I think even our school has kind of built separate facilities for student athletes. So they're going to eat separate from kind of the regular student body. A lot of them hang out with other athletes on either on their team or on different teams. So um, the days of just like striking up a conversation with a student athlete standing in line at the student center, that happens less and less, I think, nowadays. And I think in this day and age, especially NIL, student athletes, especially the premier ones, will approach kind of their college experiences is almost like a job, right? Like because it is become so lucrative. But the short answer is I think there's not as much just natural organic access as there might have been in the past, and a lot of the interactions, particularly for journalists, are structured by SIDs and other media professionals that help guide the athletes through through conversations, and they're all media trained and kind of aware of that nowadays. And so it's definitely harder just to strike up a conversation in the hallway.
Can I add to that?
Alice and Kat, advantages and disadvantages of being a student covering students.
Yeah, I think as much as, you know, I get that Northwestern isn't necessarily a powerhouse as far as athletics, our school, like Quinnipiac, is relatively unknown. And so you would think that you would think that that would be better for interaction, but it kind of goes along with the smaller the celebrity, the bigger the posse. We have even less access. I think we have so many restrictions on like how we have conversations with student athletes that we are also simultaneously treated as just students. And so we get a lot of that treatment when we're trying to talk to coaches and athletes and people in the athletic department. A lot of it's very, very closed off. And there is a benefit to being a student. You're on campus, you get to see what's going on. And unlike someone who's covering multiple teams or multiple schools or an entire conference, you are seeing those daily press releases and you're seeing what's going on and you're better able to notice those trends. But even when you notice those trends, being able to actually get someone to talk to you is incredibly difficult, because I think we're paid attention to less at times because we are just students.
I would say, to go off Cole's point on kind of how Northwestern is kind of in the middle, I feel like it kind of goes both ways on the benefits of being a student journalist. I would really agree with a lot of what he said about and we found that a lot in our reporting over the summer, is there were a lot of national outlets trying to talk to them as well, but we found that they just trusted other students more. And like Cole said, it's because, like, you know, we're part of the community and not someone who's like swooping in for like a week. And I feel like a lot of times student athletes like felt more taken advantage of by reporters from bigger organizations that were just there for like a second trying to talk to them. And in terms of the access of students, I feel like in general, yes, when you're trying to go the SID route, it is kind of like as hard as it would be for any other reporter. But I feel like in the investigative sense, with what we were working with this summer, and maybe Kat, you experienced this as well, but when it came to having to talk to athletes in ways we weren't going through the SIDs and we weren't going through the athletics department, we kind of had to like go around that. That's when being a student was really helpful, because then it could be like, oh, this friend of a friend is on the team, or you could ask your friends for contacts. And when you don't have to go through the SIDs and athletes are willing to talk to you kind of like off to the side, I feel like that's when being a student is more helpful, because that's when you can really fully use your network and you realize kind of how many student athletes are really around you.
Let's go down this road a little bit further. So, you know, Mike Fletcher writes a story that's critical of a university in some respect. He doesn't have to worry about the provost breathing down his neck. You know, he's got ESPN behind him. If you're a student, are you more vulnerable? When you were reporting these stories, which exposed conduct that was unflattering to the university, what pressure did you feel, if any, from the university itself?
I think Kat, I don't know if you might be a better person for this, because the great thing about Northwestern is that is we have a legacy journalism program. We have a journalism program that's nationally known, that's recognized, and so as much as kind of like sports brings in money and attention to Northwestern, just as it does to all colleges, in a little way, in a smaller way, kind of the journalism department does the same thing for Northwestern, I think. And so I think Northwestern knows that. And so I think we had a lot of there's a just general atmosphere of more being accepting of journalists, I think, at Northwestern than other places. And so we actually had, of course, not everybody in the administration, not everybody that we're investigating wanted these stories to be out. But in terms of kind of like the direct responses, I think we had a lot of cheerleaders, I think, on staff at Northwestern, and a lot of people who were really encouraging and reaching out. And that wasn't necessarily universally true, but from an institutional perspective, I think we felt a lot of not support, because the Daily is independent from Northwestern, but definitely kind of sympathy from the administration, or from just the institution largely, where kind of it got hairy sometimes was with alumni, with people who were kind of attached to a kind of unsullied image of the university, that they wanted to be just proud of their institution, kind of proud of the way it had been when they were a student, kind of how they were used to. And for many years, our football team, which we had reported on, was kind of just this sort of, there had an image of just like a good just a football team that might not win all the time on the field, but it was just a positive program, just had positive experiences for all of its student athletes. And I think a lot of alumni were attached to that vision of Northwestern, and so that's more of the pushback came from that side than the institution. But in saying that, I recognize how unique of a position going to Northwestern and Medill is, because of how well-known Medill is, just generally.
Tell us more about the pushback.
Yeah, I think that I mean, I got a lot of emails during the days we were reporting. I couldn't even read all of them, I think. So if you send me a nice email and I didn't respond to it, I had thousands to look through for those couple of days, and of course among the thousands were people who, some we took seriously more than others, but some, I don't know, Alice I think has more specific stories on this, but I don't know, people kind of sending us veiled threats and kind of threatening our careers and telling us how they would ensure that we would never get a job if we kept moving forward in these stories. But I don't know, some of those emails and some of those threats might be better directed towards.
Yeah, I can mention it briefly. So it was, I mean, it was an unfortunate situation. But so the reporting team this summer on the story was 3 women and 1 man. And so as we started getting pushback, a lot of the more specific threats were towards the 3 women on the reporting team, which was kind of scary. And we would get a lot of, it was hard to know what to take seriously, because we got a lot of emails from people, claiming to be connected to the football team or claiming to be players. And at this time, we were all living in Evanston on campus, as were all of the athletes. So kind of all of those circumstances made the pushback a little bit scary at times. And again, like Cole said, it really wasn't from the university. It was kind of just from these outside veiled threats. We knew the coach obviously was super mad at us, and there were some veiled threats coming through different avenues there. So I would say that was the biggest part, was kind of a lot of the alumni, a lot of the fans of the coach, because he did have a lot of fans over the years. And just kind of the fact that we were in Evanston and in the middle of that firestorm of all the athletes and so many alumni that live in the Chicagoland area, and that sort of thing all kind of came together to be a little bit of a firestorm of scary pushback for a second, but it was overwhelmingly positive. So it was a pretty easy thing to look past, but was kind of stressful as we were just like in our college town for the summer.
Well, I feel like I think looking back on it, we can see a lot of the more positive images. When you're in it, the negative ones really stand out. And so
Yeah.
even if, like, in hindsight it was really positive and people were really supportive, in the moment it really didn't feel like that, especially like 6 cups of coffee deep and you're all jittery, like running on adrenaline. It's just like, I remember one night it was completely nothing. It came out to nothing, but in the middle of our reporting process, we had gotten some threats that day, and it was just a bad day of reporting, just generally. We were all in a bad mood. We were all caffeinated, like higher than we've ever been, on working on 2 hours of sleep, and we ran downstairs and we saw like a person banging on the doors, and Nicole, who's not here, and I just like ran up to the room we were reporting and like bolted the door and like hid, and there was like sounds outdoors, and we were like, oh my God, like they're coming for us. It ended up being one of my coworkers from a different line of work that I also had during the summer, just coming to say hi. But kind of one thing that we had to manage with kind of the actual threats was the kind of expectation that we were gonna get threats, and kind of our nerves were fried. And I think after that we definitely built in a little more time just to like reflect and just sit and just relax ourselves, really take care of ourselves, and pay attention to ourselves just as much as we were to our sources. And so that was definitely a learning experience to take that time for us.
Kat, we're talking about pushback.
Yeah, so I will say that I made the editorial decision pretty early in this particular story to keep administration out of it as long as possible. So I was doing a lot of the work behind the scenes, and almost nobody was in the loop. And so that was definitely a benefit. I did not have anyone breathing down my neck for the majority of the story. When we did finally contact administration, it was radio silence. It still is. We have not gotten a response. They have not said anything. And so for this particular story, I did not feel that administrative pushback. That has not always been the case. There have been other stories in the past where I've gotten screamed at and on the phone, and there, academic punishments have been threatened, and let's get the president involved. And, I've had administrators talk about me in classes and bring me up in meetings. And I think, unlike Northwestern, we're pretty small, and the people who do things are relatively well known. And so it's hard to blend in when you're doing these kinds of things, because at a certain point, everyone knows your name, and everyone just assumes that you must be doing something. And so you do get a lot of pushback, a lot of eye rolls, a lot of just borderline passive aggressive emails up to really serious things. Not for this story. We had a story like in the past at the Chronicle where our editorial board received death threats. It's smaller, right? So it's, people know us, and it's a lot harder to escape that.
Probably means you're doing your job, Kat. They're paying attention to you and concerned about some of the things that you're doing. That's probably a pretty good sign. I'm sure the senior members of our panel today have stories about instances of intimidation and dealing with sources who push back. Anyone want to speak to that? Liz,
I
Shannon?
can jump
Mike?
in. My experience was not that long ago, so I'm happy to share some recent memories. All of the student journalism that I read as part of this panel, it was so impressive and courageous, and just took that investigative lens 10 notches higher than I was ever comfortable going. And I think that was a big weakness for me as a student journalist, is I was naturally intimidated by a lot of the potential of threats. I never had death threats, but I was in a unique position where I was also a student athlete. So that made things really complicated for me reporting on my peers with that kind of investigative perspective. So just want to congratulate all of the student journalists here for being willing to take that important risk that really does a good service to their university and to college sports as a whole, because it's a hard thing to do, and it's something that I think students really struggle with, navigating those tensions. So congrats to all of you for doing that. And thank you for setting that kind of example for others as they're thinking about stories that they could pursue and what it would take to write those stories out to completion.
Yeah, I want to add to that too. I'm a little astounded at sort of the number of threats, and I'm impressed by the courage all of you are expressing. Because I'm thinking back. Mark asked, who's tried to intimidate you in the past, and my memory's not as good as it used to be. But I don't remember like something on the level of a death threat. People threaten to sue you and things like that, and you kind of you shrug that kind of stuff off, or people just scold you. Essentially, I've been like cursed out and had the phone hung up, like where to the point where like it surprised you and almost rings in your ear. But then again, I'm from, most of my experiences, yeah, certainly as a student journalist, is in the pre-digital era where I think threats, those kinds of things are easier for those keyboard warriors. Um, so I just want to salute all of you because I've never experienced anything like that. I don't think I've had any death threats, for my journalism, and to see how resolute you guys are. And just want to add one thing, Kat. I'm still astounded that Quinnipiac has not, can get away with this radio silence, like all the way up the board, to the trustees or whoever, the president, SID. I'm astounded by that, and a little disheartened too, because that's become kind of a more familiar tactic. I think, at least in my journalism career, it feels like in the last 5 to 10 years, I get more like non-responses than I ever used to get. You used to at least get like a no comment or a statement, but almost half the time with a query now, like people just ignore it, hopefully hoping you'll go away. So anyway, that's my 2 cents there.
I'll chime in as somebody who got a good bit of threats, at the start of my career, and at the end, they were sort of bookends, and occasionally throughout for investigations. Sorry, Alice's comment about not surprisingly, the bulk of hostile comments coming at the women who are reporting hard and critically on sports does not surprise me. That was my reality 30 years ago, writing about 40 years ago, probably, writing about Jim Valvano at NC State. And it's the reality today. So that will never change. I mean, I pride myself on having a very tough, professional, steely exterior, when required. I as a reporter, the nature of my personality to build the kind of trust that's needed. I consider myself warm, always transparent, no guile. There were values I had the way I went about my work. But when somebody was threatening me, I just think it's very important to not be rattled, not show that you're rattled. And of course, you probably are rattled, inside. Writing a lot toward the end of my career about the NFL team in Washington, that certainly brought a whole host of threats and intimidation of its own. And there's nothing like the confidence you feel having the Washington Post legal team behind you, as well as really expert editing that is, you're not going to put anything in the paper that's not rock solid, So the courage that you guys have shown without the benefit of what probably, we've taken for granted at the Post, salute you even more. But if you go about your work like a professional and you're not blindsiding people, the basic, your ethics is unassailable, and the way you do your stories, you just have to be a pillar of strength, and it sounds like you all are. And I do know that there's little that brings the wrath like going after a high profile college coach. It's special breed of wrath that comes with that. So well done.
In a minute, we're going to pivot to kind of a drill down on the 2 stories that were the first and second place winner. And I'm really looking forward to that. But before we leave this kind of more, global picture, for the senior reporters on the call, is there an appetite for stories on these complicated issues in college sports these days? The NIL stories, the transfer portal stories. I think I'm talking mostly to Mike Fletcher here. Mike had a really interesting story about a week ago about coaches and enforcement of them staying in the coach's box at basketball during basketball games. It's really fascinating. That was in some ways, more of a fan-friendly story than a story about the economics of college sports. And I wonder whether that's a tough sell to editors, these stories that are more about money than about what's going on the floor.
Yeah, I mean, it's the typical yes and no answer. It is a tough sell, and the editors are always looking for a way to make these kinds of stories, they would say reader friendly. They want to attach a well-known name to it. That's a real thing at ESPN, and they've been very successful with their formula. But they really, if you're going to sort of get into these sort of more structural issues, kind of the evolution of the economics of sports, they don't want it to feel academic, right? They want to attach a name and a face, and preferably a face that to that kind of story, which raises the bar, because it sort of links to my other pet peeve. I'm always talking about access, and I should back all the way up to say I'm relatively new as a sports reporter. I spent 80% of my career covering politics and government, economics. I worked on a book about a Supreme Court justice. So this is like literally a new arena for me. And I'm struck at how like it takes more negotiating skill to get to some of these athletes than it does to like a U.S. senator for sure, or a governor, and in some ways the president. Like you can actually get a response from the White House, so it's it's just a different world here.
Yeah. I wonder about that. I wonder whether, the perception that college sports are undercovered or not aggressively covered. I wonder whether this is part of the equation, that the appetite for stories that are complicated may not be as great because the readership may not be there for those stories.
Yeah, and I think it even attaches to the thread. So you think about it, as I'm thinking about this, like there's this emotional connection that fans have to sports and to collegiate sports. I think it was Cole who referenced, I can't remember if it was Alice or Cole, who talked about how fans sort of have this, in particular alumni have this like kind of connection to this kind of mythical thing about their university and about their sports teams. And so if that's upset, that's that's upsetting, right? And that touches a lot of emotions, and I think you get the kind of craziness that flares off of that. So, I think that becomes an issue. Like in other arenas, people expect. I think the scrutiny is kind of accepted as part of the game, if you will. But in the sports arena, I think people still want you to. There's a certain element of the readership and of maybe even the editorship that wants you to stick to the game, so to speak. Just covering kind of what fans see on the court or on the field.
If I could chime in, I think all major papers, so, papers still standing, are certainly struggling with the tension between what gets traffic, what gets read. And for better or worse, we have every possible metric known to man about what it is getting read and how deeply, how much, versus what is your obligation as a journalist. What are the stories that must be told, the stories with victims, or the stories that maybe people don't wake up thinking you want to read but need to be informed. So you want that tension's never going to go away, but you want it to be a healthy tension, a fight. But you can sometimes readers will surprise you. And I just think you always have to follow your North Star of what you think is the most compelling story, and bring everything you have to convince your editor this deserves attention. And one of the really interesting moments I'm sure we all remember, it's only been 3 years, was this time in the pandemic, I guess it was 3 years ago, when the Oregon women's basketball player made a little video of the women's weight room in the NCAA tournament that was like a joke with like a teeny barbell and maybe a towel. I mean, I exaggerate. And then that was contrasted with what the men's tournament had. And, you know, this wasn't student journalism driven, but it was student driven. Sedona Price, I think was her name, the Oregon player. And this overnight prompted, you know, such overdue soul searching about how bad is the inequity? What does Title IX mean? How can it be manifested in such an egregious way? And it was a very healthy soul searching, and I think led to some investigations. And I believe it's led to a narrowing of the disparities. But I mean, Mark, that is a story about policy, economics, all the things that you might think, oh my God, that's going to bore readers to tears. No, nobody's going to want to read that. But if it's compelling and eye-popping, I mean, people must read about these issues. And it's our challenge to find ways to tell them with integrity, but also that just make you go, oh my God. And Sedona Price surely did that.
And I'll echo Liz's comments just briefly. I don't want to take too much time away from talking about the student work, but I had a similar experience when I was working at Yahoo, which was one of the best places that I worked, where metrics mattered, but they also gave space for investigative pieces. And they kind of recognized that even if these stories don't get read, they still matter so much to the sports ecosystem. We have to cover them. So as long as we write enough buzzy pieces that get enough clicks, we can invest time and money into investigative stories. And I think this is a good message for editors around the country, is that these stories, people need to know about them. And the best examples are the students on this call writing stories that have big impacts on students, future students, recruiting, the institutions in which these students are based at. These stories matter, and to not cover them just because they're not going to get clicks is doing a disservice to readers and to the country. And so I think that sometimes a good story is worth publishing just because it's a good story and it's about an important topic. And even if it doesn't get clicks, or even if it doesn't change a reader's mind. I know there's a lot of, we talk about NIL, like the narratives around NIL are so sensationalized that a good, hearty feature story about the realities of NIL may not change how people still talk about it, but it's still important to put that message out there and get the facts to readers who want to potentially think more deeply about these topics.
Yeah, and let's not forget, I mean, the Washington Post has a beat reporter assigned to NIL, Jesse Doherty, who's doing a fabulous job. So it's not as if, you know, mainstream media has turned its back on these issues. They're being written about, but they're complicated. It's more challenging to read a story about, you know, conference realignment than it is about how many points Caitlin Clark scored last night. So that's a reality. Okay, it's time now to pivot to the stars of the show and to talk about their work and really drill down on how it all came together. The judges on this call, we know all about your work, and we have a really good idea, thanks to you, about how it came together. But I have a feeling that many people listening to the Zoom don't even know what your stories were about. So let's take a few minutes to talk about your reporting and how it came together. And let's start with the Daily Northwestern delegation, Allison Cole, and tell us about, you know, were you hanging out at a Starbucks? What happened when this started?
Close. It was a Whole Foods. Actually, it was a Whole Foods. And that's not even a lie. That's actually what happened when the email, at least for me, when it came into my inbox.
What's your story? What were your stories? Because there were two stories that were submitted. Just give us,
so
you know, 30,000-foot summary of what they were about.
basically they were similar, but had some differences. The first was kind of this inside look into a really a player's perspective, but into just the whole locker room culture. And we detailed kind of practices of coerced sexual hazing in the Northwestern football team. And then we had followed that up a couple days later with a story on racism, particularly from coaches and teammates towards players of color. And that was also, I mean, it was the players kind of perspective and the perspective that we took in the article that was we should also consider these acts of racism as hazing, as a kind of different form of hazing, but hazing nonetheless. And so the first story had come really
Go back to the Whole Foods and
so
start
there's a
again.
little prologue to the Whole Foods, which is what that morning there was a press release from Northwestern saying that they had done an internal investigation, had found uh, some evidence of hazing on the football team, and that the coach had been suspended for 2 weeks, kind of in the middle of summer, not recruiting, not in like practices, kind of just in a dead period in the summer, really like a 2 week unpaid vacation. And so of course that catches our attention. It was also a Friday, which a Friday news dump, a little bit of a cliche, but it's true. And so we had known that there's kind of an investigation happening, but nobody really could like dig into it. Just because Northwestern's a private university, it's a bit difficult to really know what the administration is doing if they don't want you to. And so that had been going on for months before, and it had come out and completed the suspension. Alice, I think, wrote a little brief about it, and we had kind of been like, oh, that's interesting, but thought that it might take weeks, months to dig into. So we went about our day. I had plans. I was shopping for dinner at Whole Foods, and that's when kind of an email from a former player hit our inbox and was like, look, here's what I had told Northwestern, uh, and they didn't really do that much with it. Uh, here's something that you should know, and sent us a document full of a lot of allegations. Not all of them we reported, just because there were so many, and we really, the battle for that first story was in verification, just because it's hard to corroborate a lot of things that happen behind closed doors. So we were like, we triaged that document. We were first like, okay, what just off the bat is like easily verifiable, right? Like what can we verify with a couple interviews, maybe a couple pictures? What can we do? And then what's probably harder? And let's set aside. And we kind of took a couple of different approaches. One, we just called everybody that we knew, including like they weren't implicated in the hazing, but we called like the bus driver for the team, like just anybody associated. We didn't get a ton of luck on a Friday night with that approach, but what we did get um was people mentioned specifically in the allegations, people that kind of the person who first said the allegations had brought up or kind of pointed us towards. Those are the kind of people we started talking to and having better luck with. And throughout that night and the next morning, we would kind of we reached out to those people and we're able to corroborate kind of a set of the allegations, which you see in our first story. And less than, I think it was like 17 hours after we got the email, we felt like we had it corroborated enough to publish the story, and that's when we pressed send. And then afterwards, we knew we wanted to follow this up, and so at the same time, we got in contact with some other players who really wanted to focus not particularly on the haze or the sexual hazing, which they had experienced and was in that story, but really on kind of this different brand of hazing, which were these really racist acts from coaches, notably kind of coaches made players, particularly Black players, cut dreadlocks, whereas white players would be allowed to have longer hairstyles. And uh, and then also some hazing practices from the team where kind of racial messages were shaved into players' heads, and so throughout the next couple of days, we kind of just really boots on the ground, kind of reporting, just like old school, like tell me who you know, who was there, let me talk to them, kind of, and also doing our own sourcing, trying to reach out to people that we had thought might be around those teams or those around those same spaces, trying to track down their numbers, and we had a lot of luck doing that, especially over the course of the weekend as the story kind of built momentum. People were more willing to talk, and that's how we kind of crafted the second story. And a couple hours after we had finally pressed send on that second story, our longtime football coach, was out of a job, and from there we continue to report kind of allegations as they had come in, and we could verify them. But we became more wary as kind of the lawyers started to come into the situation, and this lawsuits started to pile up. We didn't know which kind of tips or allegations were kind of coming in from the lawyers versus the players, and so we even had to be even more careful than we were at the start of the story to make sure we were just doing like PR for a law firm, and we were really getting to the actual players and not just the lawyers and what the lawyers wanted us to report in the future. So it kind of evolved over the course of a couple weeks, but yeah, it was a roller coaster for sure.
So everyone jump in here. I mean, this is fascinating, and I'm sure some of our veteran reporters will want to chime in about the process. So the initial tip was from a player who chose to remain anonymous. How did you feel about that? And tell us about the conversations about whether you would be comfortable sourcing the story primarily to an anonymous player.
Let me interrupt real quick here. I'm so sorry, but I have to jump off, guys, to go to a meeting. But I just want to say again, congratulations to Alice, Kat, Cole. Outstanding work. Good seeing you again, Liz, Clark. I see you across the newsroom, and Shannon and Mark. Take care.
Thank you, Mike.
All right.
I can jump in on the anonymous sourcing thing. So I would say the first thing that we made sure is that we as the reporting team knew that the anonymous source was who he said he was. So we like FaceTimed him, we saw his like driver's license, his ID, we had him send us like mail from his Northwestern like student account, the account that he had when he went here, so that we knew he was who he says he was. And so we went through a lot of different hoops to kind of check out his identity and make sure that all of that was in line. And then it was definitely a tough discussion on how to deal with the anonymous sourcing. We definitely wanted to weigh like the safety of the source, because we knew that this was very sensitive information and we didn't want anything to happen to this person. And he was, of course, asking to be anonymous. And so eventually we ended up being comfortable with that when we could, obviously we verified who he was, and then we could corroborate his information with other people who had been on the team. We were confident enough that this information was true, and we were confident enough that we could then run it with just the anonymous source. And then we were really grateful that down the line we were able to get more people on the record who came forward with like their full names and their identities and said the exact same thing that the initial anonymous whistleblower said. So it all kind of panned out well in the way that we were able to eventually put names and faces to these claims for people that were asking for that. But in the initial story, we just felt like that was kind of the safest way to go about it, and we didn't want to push the sources kind of too far and put them and make them uncomfortable. And I think that ended up being kind of a good approach for us, because we ended up building a lot of great relationships with sources that were more willing to then like send us to their friends and give us more sources. And maybe if we had pushed super hard and made people come on the record, it wouldn't have been such a good and beneficial relationship that helped us with our future reporting as well.
And we also corroborated everything that those sources said, and with other sources that we knew had been around the football team. Those we I think I realized that like if we are gonna run with anonymous sources, because it wasn't just one, we had multiple sources, anonymous sources throughout this whole thing. Which is like the only names that are gonna be on this story are our names, right? And so we're kind of saying, okay, we're willing to put ourselves in front of the firing squad for our sources. And if I was putting my name on the story, I was going to be confident in kind of what we were reporting first and foremost. And so as soon as we knew that we had anonymous sources and we had enough that we thought we could convince our readership, it really became a question of are you convinced yourself, right? Like, are you willing to put yourself in front, shield the source, right? And and as soon, and we had different ways of, there's different ways of like building that for yourself, which is like you can talk off the record, you can review kind of photographs and material that don't make it in the article, um, kind of reporting on background, that kind of stuff, that can make yourself confident in what you know with the story. And as soon as you have enough, a couple sources to convince the readership that it's true, you could have a lot more that convinces yourself that it's also good to publish, that the reader never even sees, and feel good about kind of putting your name on the article that way. You know, just you want to be, you almost become a source, you almost become kind of like, since your name is on it, you want to be an expert in what you're reporting if you're going to use an anonymous source, and that way you feel comfortable, kind of uh asking the reader to trust you, to ask to say to the reader, like, you can trust me.
I'd love to ask Alice and Cole just about the structure at the Daily Northwestern when you have an investigation, something that that has tremendous weight. Do you have a lawyer, like an of counsel? Like, was this story lawyered before you hit send, or publish? How does that work?
Yeah, so the story was looked through by a lawyer. So basically how it works is, because the Daily Northwestern is not associated with the university, we have a board of directors. Basically, it's called the SPC, that is made up of professionals, adult professionals who all have other jobs but sit on this board. And that's where kind of our funding comes from. And so they don't have any editorial control. And we generally don't interact with them too much in day-to-day kind of daily production. But for this specific instance, the president of the board is a lawyer. And so he was super helpful throughout the whole summer. We were calling him at like strange hours of the night when he was just like home with his family, and he was really great. And so he looked over this piece as well as some of our follow-ups, to make sure that, we weren't going to get sued and that everything was phrased the right way. So that also definitely gave us a lot of confidence that we were kind of safe from a legal perspective.
Wonderful. That's well explained. Thank you.
But just to add on, like, we didn't have like a lawyer on retainer. Like, this was definitely like a resource that we knew we had and like asked favors for, and he was very willing, and we're so grateful that he was able to lend us a helping hand. But I think what people don't realize was, but this was during the summer, we didn't have a full staff. And so it's kind of the four of us really in a room, uh working by ourselves, and without kind of the whole support of like a national media organization, or really just the daily, just generally throughout the school year. A lot of just the legwork in terms of editing, reporting, writing, it all fell to all of us, and that was something that we were aware of. We were like, wow, it's kind of really us against the world here. And we had a couple students who had volunteer support on the back end here and there, but for the most part, it was just kind of all of us writing, reporting, dealing with media requests, kind of really just going in alone, and so that definitely made it a big challenge.
So I have two questions for you. Number one, at any point, did you think that this story was competitive, and that if you didn't write it, if you didn't publish when you did, it might appear in the Tribune or some other news organization? The other thing I'd love to hear you talk about, I mean, this was, like a volcano exploding. I'm reading from your entry. In the first 4 months since publication, the July 8 story had received 874,000 page views. This may have been the most read sports story in the country last year. As you were reporting the story and getting it ready for publication, did you have any idea how big a story it was?
You want to take the first one, Ellis? I'll take the second.
Yeah, on the competition aspect of it. So yes, we definitely did feel that way. We did know that the whistleblower that reached out to us had reached out to a couple other outlets, mainly in Chicagoland. So that was definitely a stressor right in the beginning. Once we started talking to him and we knew that kind of we were who he was talking to, we felt more comfortable. But definitely that first night, there was kind of a feeling of competition of other people have this information. And so that definitely added a lot of stress. And we worked through the night because obviously we had to corroborate everything and we didn't want to rush anything. So that was definitely a stressful element at the beginning. And then I think once we got the first few stories out, we were actually really grateful when larger outlets started picking it up because we were getting, as we mentioned, a lot of heat, especially because being students, a lot of people were kind of discrediting it a little bit. Again, overall, it was mostly positive, but there were some people that were discrediting it because we were students. And so when there was a piece that stood out to us, I remember it was The Athletic had done a deep dive on this like a week after we initially published. They kind of saw our article and decided to look into it. And when that was published, it felt like it gave the issue a lot more kind of validity. And that's people were like, oh, they were right in the beginning. So once we had broken it, I think the additional coverage was kind of nice to kind of take the weight off of our shoulders a little bit so that people could stop doubting the work that we had initially done.
And to the thing about kind of the page views, like I think we all recognize, we all were confident that the campus would listen, kind of Chicagoland would probably listen to our story, but there's no way to foresee kind of like the really the world listening to what you write. And so when the page views are amazing, but we're not kind of aware of that on a day-to-day basis. What we were paying attention to were the Twitter, or I guess X now, the X views. It was Twitter back then when we were writing the story. But we were paying attention to that, and we got like 11. It ended up at around like a little over 11 million impressions on X, and in the first day we might have hit 10 million, and you just saw it like tick up. And I remember it's overwhelming if you pay attention to that, if you're not used to it. And I remember uh it was on kind of our follow-up story. I was doing some interviews, and I couldn't even like relate to the sources. Like I couldn't even say like, oh, I'm sorry you went through that, or kind of that is just a terrible kind of position or a situation, or kind of offer any kind of human connection with the people I'm talking to, because I was so paranoid that like if the tapes got released, would people think I was an objective enough journalist, or was I too biased, or like whatever, because I was so focused on the kind of like the kind of discourse, the noise around the story, rather than focusing on the reporting, that I ended up doing worse reporting in kind of the midsection of the story. And I realized that I was like, what are you doing? Like, you have a responsibility first and foremost to the story and your sources. And I had to like take like a step back of like a moment of self-reflection and be like, why are you doing this, Cole? Right? Are you doing it for the views on Twitter? Are you going to do this for all the keyboard warriors out there? Or are you kind of doing this for for kind of a sense of truth, and also a sense of kind of wanting to shine light on what the sources were telling you? And I was like, I have to respect kind of the courage that it takes for these people to come up to me and tell me these things. And it really took that moment of reflection, that realization, to recenter kind of my priorities when when all the noise was building online around this story. It really took just a conscious effort throughout, I think, for me, to remain dedicated and focused on what mattered in this story.
So impressed listening to you two. You're just terrific. I have more respect for the work that you did. I don't know that that's possible because I was so impressed having read them initially, but you guys have a lot to be proud of. We could go on for a long time talking about this story, but I want to turn to Kat Murphy, to talk about her second place prize winning story, which is terrific. And again, Kat, I think many people watching us now don't know about your story. So start at the beginning. Tell us what the subject was and how it, did it fall from the sky? How did you find this story?
Yeah, so I was sitting at home on the couch with laryngitis, and it was right after New Year's, and Quinnipiac Athletics put out a press release it was 3 sentences, and it said, head coach of the women's lacrosse team, Tanya Kotowitz, is leaving the program. She's been here X amount of seasons, and the associate head coach is going to serve as interim head coach. That was a whole press release. Within 5 minutes, I got a text saying, like, you need to dig deeper on this. Like, there's more going on here. And I had, like, that was pretty clear because I actually was the last reporter to cover a women's lacrosse game that she coached. So I had covered the last playoff game that they had played in when they lost in the playoffs the previous spring. And I had spoken with her afterward, and it was very clear that she wasn't she wasn't planning on leaving. This was the best season they had in many, many years. And there was no indication that she was like, ah, yeah, time to pack it up. And so it was very odd. It was a very odd press release. It was a very odd presentation of the press release. It was just very weird. And that's where it started. And then by the end of that day, I was setting up a meeting with someone, an in-person meeting at a Starbucks to look over documents that they could not send me. I had to actually go and view them myself because I could not keep them.
So at some point you decided that this is a story I want to pursue. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so unlike Northwestern, we do not have a staff, like really a staff. Like it's kind of just Eward and a couple people. And so when you talk about, like, doing investigations, for the most part in my time here, I have been the person that's been doing them, and I have had to bear most of that responsibility by myself. We don't have many people who have the time or the resources to do that. And so it was kind of me, or it didn't get looked at necessarily. And I know that's a weird way to put it, but that was kind of how it was. And the person who contacted me originally and the person I was setting up a meeting with were both basically like, yeah, you need to look into this. If you don't, like, they were like, I don't know if you can uncover this, but if anyone can, it would be you. And that's a lot of weight to put on my shoulders. It's on an early day in January where I'm like, I kind of just want to go back to watching TV. But yeah, so that, I mean, it was very clear from the people who were contacting me and the gravity of the things that they were saying that it was something that needed to be looked at. But I knew pretty quickly that it was gonna be just me.
Yeah. So the story is about why the women's lacrosse coach was leaving the university, and there was much more than what was shared in that press release.
Well, it's
So
hard to share less.
right. Tell us more about that. What did you learn about the circumstances?
Yeah, so after setting up that meeting with that person, I learned that there had been an athlete who had been injured and was coming back from her injury, and she had cleared all of the athletic train, like all of their like clearance mechanisms, and she, with regard to their mechanisms should have been cleared to play. But the team had 4 athletic trainers and also another athletic trainer that wasn't working with players, but that was administrating these athletic trainers. And so there's this round robin of like information where it's just everyone has different information and no one had the same information. And there were 2 separate injury reports, and sometimes they said different things. And they were going to this tournament, off-season tournament, and there's nobody on the bus. There's no trainer on the bus. And the player is texting with the trainer she had worked most closely with, saying, "Hey, am I cleared to play?" And the trainer said, "No, you're not. I don't think so." It wasn't like a straight no. It was a probably not. But a different trainer had told the player yes, because she had cleared the mechanisms, because the trainer who had told her yes had been at the practice that she had been at when she cleared the protocol. And the trainer who was saying no hadn't been, but there was no trainer on the bus. And it turned out that was pretty much how all of their athletic training systems worked. That's how that team had worked with athletic trainers. And it also came out in those documents that the coach had been raising questions and had been raising concerns about these systems for months. And she had been saying, "Hey, this isn't okay. This is like dangerous," because there were instances where there wouldn't be a trainer at practice, and like coaches would be driving players to the training room in their cars, and they didn't have a trainer, so they had a walkie-talkie. And that was the solution. This wasn't like they gave everyone walkie-talkies. The coach had to beg for a walkie-talkie. And all of these things came out in those documents.
Did the coach talk to you?
No. Nope. Did not
How did
respond.
how did you deal with that?
Well, I contacted her lawyer, who also did not respond. I do believe at the end, I think on the very last day when we said we're publishing this, she did say no comment. I believe at the end she said no comment, but up to that point I had not talked to her or the player, actually. Only the player's dad would talk to me.
Yeah, tell us about that. Tell us about the player's dad.
Yeah, so I was sitting on my couch with laryngitis, like I said, and I get a random call from not Connecticut, and I pick up the phone, and the person on the other end is like, "Hi, I'm so and so. I'm so and so's dad." And I'm like, "Oh, I'm about to get screamed at," because the player, I had reached out to her on Instagram, which I am not allowed to do, like SID, like that's a huge no-no. And again, like should be noted that the interim head coach of our women's lacrosse team after the firing of the first coach is the fiance of the head athletic communications guy. So they're engaged. So we were never going to get access, period. But that just kind of complicated that situation. So I reached out to her personally and I was like, "Hey, I know what happened." And she was like, "Somebody violated my HIPAA rights. I don't want to talk to you." That was the end of that conversation. And I sent one more text and I was like, "Hey, I don't blame you for being frustrated. I would also be frustrated, but I'm like, this is why TK, the coach, had been fired. Like this was the incident that administration is trying to portray as the incident that led to her firing, because they were alleging that she had done one of 2 things: either falsified the injury report and or lied about it and played an injured player knowingly. And all of that didn't really make sense with the evidence with the documents that I found. It was clear that they did not have that evidence. It was also clear that even if they wanted to argue that she had played the player had cleared injury protocol according to what they had said. And so none of the stories added up. But the player didn't want to talk to me. And so I was like, okay, I got to find a different route. And then the player's dad did call me and was like, "Hey, we love our coach too much to not talk to you." He was like, "I don't actually want to talk to you. And I don't really understand why someone shared this information with you, but it's clear that you already know it. So I'm going to talk to you so long as my daughter isn't involved in the story at all. So as long as her name is out of it, her story is out of it, and she is not quoted at all. Because he was worried that it was going to end up in court. And so he was like, I want everything to come out of my mouth, not hers.
Wow. How did you know that you had enough, Kat, to publish?
So the documents were relatively conclusive. I could prove who sent them, and I could prove what they said. Like that was relatively conclusive. Like I said, I couldn't keep any of them, but I could verify them in person and take notes on them. And so I could verify that content. And then the player wouldn't talk to me. The dad actually didn't reach back out to me until after I had gotten these documents and after I had corroborated the documents. And so at that point, what I needed was the player, or evidently the player's dad, to confirm what the document said, because these documents are basically alleging that the university fired her, knowing that their accusations were not valid. And the only way we can prove that those accusations that their accusations didn't make sense, that they weren't grounded in fact, was for the player to be like, yeah, that didn't happen. And the player's dad was like, yeah, that didn't happen. That's not what happened. And so at that point, what the document said, what the player's dad was saying, were completely consistent. And I didn't tell the player's dad what I knew. And so he basically said everything the documents had said, and more. And then he had also provided me with videos like of his daughter at practice, and to prove that she had practiced and cleared the injury protocol, he sent me text messages that she had with the trainer. So I had gotten at that point like a lot of evidence that supported this narrative. And so we went to athletics and they declined to comment. And that was when we
Time to go.
published.
Great. Well, congratulations. Great work. We are almost out of time. We've got 4 or 5 questions. I'm just going to throw a dart and pick one for the panel. So students and judges, here's the question. SIDs, Sports Information Directors, are a lifeline to our industry, but what is the best plan of action when they become gatekeepers instead of facilitators? Who wants to take that one? Have SIDs been helpful to you in your reporting? Yes or no?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, this is a consistent problem, right? This isn't just this story. We have problems with them almost constantly trying to get
Yeah.
information. And I think when we have these bigger high profile stories, it makes everything worse. So like in the aftermath of this story, we have gotten considerably less access than we were getting before, which wasn't much. And also like, but there's other things that they do. Like if a team loses, we don't get player access. That's a rule. Like if a team loses, you can have the coach, maybe. And but you don't get players. You only get players if they win, and not if they win on the road. Only if they win at home. And so like it's really hard for us at least to get access. And I don't know what the solution is, because we've tried everything to, from institutional pressure to us repeatedly calling them. I think we called them 12 times for this story, and we used different people's phones to like get the number off of, like, to not have it. But at a certain point, I think either the SID blocked us or he was just like, he had turned it off his phone.
Can I jump in?
SIDs don't like bad news stories. We know that. Liz?
Yeah, no, this just dismays me, and dismays is as kind as I can put it, because this was a trend of SIDs being more kind of obstructionist, if you will, 20 years ago, and it's obviously gone in the not great direction. But to blurt out a couple thoughts, I mean, SIDs are always going to be gatekeepers above facilitators. That's just a fact. They are paid by the university to protect the university's image. So I think it's time to lose any notion that their job is to facilitate. I mean, they will facilitate a narrative that they want to spin. So, I mean, I think the first step is eyes wide open. They work for the university. Their frontline duty is protect the university's image. So I think when you have a controversial story, or a story that might not be well received, it's the reporter's challenge, as honestly and directly and intelligently as possible, to explain why it's in the university's interest, why it's in the coach's interest, to have some transparency here and let me understand the situation, let me observe the situation, let me ask my questions. This just breaks my heart, as does this notion that they shut down access after a team loses. I mean, on its face, that's just so laughable. If you think, what is the whole purpose of higher education, of college, to prepare young people for life? And who in their life is going to go through saying, we shield you from all disappointment? You know, it doesn't happen in the workplace. And, you know, again, not to get on a high horse, but I just think the conversation, the pressure from the journalists has to be, I just see this in their interest as a developing, you know, athlete and student, as I am as developing journalist. You know, we don't run from a loss. We don't run from disappointment or a missed field goal. I'll stop there.
That is such a great place to leave this discussion, with great advice from Liz Clark. Of course, if our expectation is that sports information directors are going to be facilitators, we're going to spend a lot of our life disappointed in the outcome, because they're not working for us, they're working for the institution. I had a blast. I mean, I'm kind of a sports journalism nerd, so of course I had a good time. But I learned so much, and I was so inspired by the conversation and the work of the student journalists on this call. So hats off to all of you. I wish we had time to talk about what's next for you, because I am very hopeful that all of you will be pursuing journalism as a career, because you've really demonstrated, I think, to the judges and everyone on this call that you really have a lot to offer to this profession. So forget about law school, sports journalism. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the audience and to the panel. It was a great conversation. Take care.